The nursery was burning again. Emperor Dohan stood in the doorway and watched the fire suppression system drown the room in white foam. The walls were black. The feeding station was melted into a twisted lump of metal. 2 medical officers from the Pelian species were being carried out on stretchers, their soft blue skin covered in blisters. One of them was unconscious. The other was screaming. This was the 7th time. Dohan closed his eyes and breathed slowly through his nose. Behind him, the palace staff stood in perfect silence. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. When the emperor was quiet like this, it meant his anger had gone past shouting and into something much colder. "How long did they last?" he asked. Taiwan, his chief advisor and cousin, checked his datapad. 11 days, Your Majesty. The ones before them lasted 9. Yes. And the ones before that? 6. But in fairness, the Garathi team also broke 3 containment walls and caused a diplomatic incident that cost us. I remember. Dohan turned away from the ruined nursery. His long cloak dragged through the foam on the floor. But he did not seem to notice or care. 7 species, 7 failures. My hatchlings have driven away every caretaker in this quadrant of the galaxy. Taiwan walked beside him as they moved down the long corridor of the Imperial Palace. The palace was built from black volcanic stone, and the halls were wide enough for Varith adults to spread their wings. Rivers of warm water ran beneath the glass floors, heating the stone from below. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like everything the Varith built. "There is one more option," Taiwan said carefully. "If you suggest machines again." "Not machines." Taiwan pulled up a file on his datapad. "A human." He looked at Taiwan the way someone looks at a person who has just said something very stupid. "A human?" "Yes. The small ones, the soft ones, the ones with no scales, no fire, no venom, no claws, and bones that break if they fall from a moderate height. Those are the ones, yes." Dohan started walking again. "No. Your Majesty, my hatchlings burned through Pelian bioarmor. They cracked stoneback shields. They made a Garathi warbeast run away crying. And you want to send in a human? They would die in minutes." Taiwan kept pace with him. He had been Dohan's advisor for 20 years. He knew when to push. "This particular human has an interesting record. She is a nurse from a frontier medical station near the Outer Rim. Last cycle, a Garathi transport beast went into a panic during a medical transfer. The beast was 300 tons. It was destroying the station. No sedative worked. No restraint held. This human walked into the room alone, unarmed, and calmed the beast in 40 minutes. How? The report says she sang to it." Dohan said nothing for a long time. They reached the end of the corridor and stepped onto a balcony overlooking the capital city of Kareth Prime. Below them, the city glowed with rivers of lava channeled through ancient stone. Ships moved across the dark sky like slow-moving stars. "My hatchlings are the first Imperial clutch born in 200 years, Dohan said quietly. "Without them, my bloodline ends. Without my bloodline, the rival houses will tear this empire apart. Every species I have trusted with their care has failed, and now you bring me a human nurse who sings." "I bring you the only option left," Taiwan said. Dohan gripped the balcony railing. His claws left marks in the stone. "Send the summons." 3 weeks later, a small trade freighter landed at the Imperial docking platform. It was an ugly ship, dented and patched in several places. The palace landing crew, dressed in ceremonial armor, watched with visible confusion as the cargo ramp lowered and a single human woman walked out. Yuna was not what anyone expected. She was short, even by human standards. She carried one bag over her shoulder and wore a simple medical uniform that had been washed so many times the color had faded from blue to something closer to gray. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot. She looked around at the massive palace, at the armored guards, at the rivers of fire that ran along the edges of the landing platform, and her expression did not change. She looked like someone arriving for a normal day of work. Suji was waiting for her at the base of the platform. Suji was a veteran dragon keeper, one of the few Verath who had worked directly with the hatchlings and survived. The left side of her face carried a burn scar that pulled at the corner of her eye. She looked at Yuna the way a soldier looks at a civilian who has wandered onto a battlefield. "You are the human," Suji said. It was not a question. "I am Yuna. Follow me. Do not touch anything. Do not wander. The palace is not designed for your kind, and I do not have time to scrape you off the floor if you fall into a thermal vent." Yuna followed without complaint. They descended deep beneath the palace, through reinforced corridors that got hotter with every level. The walls changed from polished stone to raw metal plating. Blast doors lined the hallway, each one thicker than the last. It felt less like a nursery and more like a prison. "The hatchlings are inside," Suji said, stopping at the final door. "Bomi is the largest. She is aggressive. Hanul is the middle one. He panics easily and produces uncontrolled fire bursts when stressed. Nari is the smallest. She is not eating. She may not survive the month." Suji paused. "The previous caretakers wore full thermal armor. I can arrange a set for you." "No thank you," Yuna said. Suji stared at her. "You will go in without armor." "Armor tells them I am afraid. I do not want to start with fear." "Armor keeps you alive." "I will manage." Suji opened the door. The nursery was a large reinforced chamber lit by orange thermal lights. The air was thick and hot, almost hard to breathe. Scorch marks covered every surface. In the far corner, Bomi crouched like a coiled spring, her young scales dark red, her eyes locked on the door with immediate hostility. In the center, Hanul paced in tight circles, small sparks flickering from his nostrils with every nervous breath. And near the back wall, curled into a tiny ball, barely visible, was Nari. She was the size of a large cat. She was not moving. Yuna stood in the doorway for a long moment. She looked at each of them. Bomi growled, low and threatening. Hanul's sparks increased. Nari did not react at all. Yuna set her bag down. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a heavy metallic sound. She turned to Suji, who was watching through the observation window. "How long has it been," Yuna asked quietly, "since anyone just sat with them?" Suji opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She did not have an answer. Yuna nodded. She sat down on the scorched floor, cross-legged, hands resting open on her knees. She did not move toward the hatchlings. She did not call to them. She did not try to feed them or restrain them or scan them with instruments. She simply sat, and she waited. In the observation room above, Taewon watched the monitors and shook his head. "She will not last the night," he said. On the screen, Bomi took one step toward the human. Then another. Then she stopped, tilted her head, and for the first time in weeks, she did not roar. Yuna did not sleep that first night. She sat on the floor of the nursery with her legs crossed and her hands open on her knees. Bomi watched her from the corner with eyes that glowed like hot coals. Every few minutes, the large hatchling would take a step closer, then stop, then growl, then step back. She was testing, waiting for Yuna to flinch, to run, to fight. That was what every other caretaker had done, and Bomi knew exactly how to respond to all three. But Yuna did none of those things. She just sat there, breathing slowly, and after 3 hours, Bomi lay down 6 feet away from her and fell asleep. In the observation room, Taewon replayed the footage 4 times. He did not understand what had happened. By the second day, Yuna had read all 700 pages of the ancient Vereth hatchling protocols. The documents described a strict system of care that had been used for thousands of years. Dominance displays to establish authority. Thermal machinery to regulate body temperature. Feeding through armored chutes so the caretaker would not be burned. Strict schedules. No physical contact. No unstructured time. Yuna read every page. Then she put the documents down, looked at the ceiling, and said, "No wonder they are miserable." She began her own way. For Bomi, she started with play. The ancient protocols said that aggressive hatchlings must be subdued through shows of strength. Yuna thought this was completely wrong. She had seen the same behavior in human children 1,000 times. Bomi was not attacking because she was dominant. She was attacking because she was scared and bored, and had far too much energy with no safe way to release it. Yuna spent one full day collecting materials from the palace maintenance rooms. She took fireproof fabric, metal rods, thick cables, and sheets of heat-resistant plating. The palace staff watched her drag these things through the corridors, with visible confusion. Nobody stopped her, but nobody helped her either. She built toys. They were rough and ugly. A ball made from wrapped fireproof fabric that Bomi could bite and throw and burn without breaking. A thick rope for pulling. A series of metal rings hanging from cables that Bomi could chase and snap at. Yuna set them up around the nursery and then sat back and waited. Bomi stared at the objects for a long time. Then she pounced on the ball and shook it in her jaws like a wild thing. She threw it across the room. She chased it. She burned it with a short burst of flame, and when it did not break, she made a sound that Yuna had never heard from her before. It was not a growl or a roar. It was something close to delight. Within 2 days, Bomi's unprovoked attacks dropped to 0. But she was no longer throwing herself at the walls or charging at the observation window. She had something to do. For Hanyul, the problem was different. The middle hatchling was not aggressive. He was terrified. Every loud sound made him flinch, and every flinch produced a burst of fire from his nostrils that he could not control. The nursery was full of sounds. The hum of the thermal systems, the clank of the blast doors, the buzz of the overhead lights. To human ears, these sounds were just background noise. To Hanyul, they were constant threats. Yuna figured this out on the 3rd day, when she noticed that Hanyul's fire bursts always happened within 2 seconds of a mechanical sound. She timed it. She mapped it. She was sure. She went to Suji. "I need soft fabric, as much as you can find, and something to absorb sound." Suji looked at her with her one good eye. "What for?" "I am going to build him a quiet place." Suji did not understand, but she brought the materials. Yuna used her own jacket, 2 blankets from her bag, and several rolls of insulation fabric to create a padded corner in the nursery. She layered the walls with soft material. She covered the floor with thick cloth. She blocked the overhead vent that carried the worst of the mechanical noise. Then she sat inside the quiet corner and started tapping the floor with her fingers. A slow, steady rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, like a heartbeat. Hanyul noticed. His head turned. His nostrils stopped sparking. He took 1 step toward the sound, then another, and then he crawled into the quiet corner and pressed his body against the floor where Yuna was tapping. Within 10 minutes, he was asleep. It was the first time Hanyul had slept peacefully since he was born. She said nothing, but she did not leave for a long time. Nari was the hardest. The smallest hatchling had not eaten in 9 days when Yuna arrived. She lay in the back of the nursery, curled into a ball, her scales gray and dull. She did not respond to food placed near her. She did not respond to heat adjustments. She did not respond to the medical scans that the palace doctors performed through the observation systems. She was dying slowly, and no one knew why. Yuna sat near Nari for hours, watching, not scanning, not measuring, just watching. And on the fourth day, she noticed something that all the doctors and protocols and machines had missed. Every time a sound came from across the room, even a small one, Nari's body flinched, not in fear like Haenul, but in longing. She was turning toward the sound, then turning away, reaching out for something, then pulling back. She is lonely, Yuna said out loud to the empty room. Yuna had read about this in her training. In human medicine they called it touch starvation. Babies who were never held, never touched, never felt the warmth of another living body against their skin, sometimes simply stopped eating. They stopped growing. They stopped trying. The body decided that if no one was coming, there was no reason to keep going. Nari had never been held. The protocols did not allow physical contact. The caretakers wore armor. The feeding was done through chutes. From the moment she hatched, Nari had been alone in a room full of machines. Yuna reached out and picked Nari up. The hatchling's scales were hot, not burning, but hot enough to hurt. Yuna felt the heat soak through her sleeves and into her forearms. Within seconds, a chemical secretion from Nari's underbelly began to irritate her skin. Small blisters formed on her palms. Yuna held her anyway. She pressed Nari against her chest, one hand supporting the hatchling's head, the other cradling her body. She rocked slowly back and forth. She hummed a low, quiet melody, nothing special, just a simple tune she used to hum during night shifts at the medical station. Nari was stiff at first. Then, slowly, the tiny hatchling relaxed. Her tail, which had been curled tight around her body, loosened. Her breathing changed. She pressed her head into the curve of Yuna's neck. It was the first time anyone had held her since she was born. That evening, Taewon came down to the nursery. He saw Yuna sitting on the floor, her hands wrapped in medical bandages, blisters visible on her wrists, still holding Nari. He stood in the doorway, and his expression was something between anger and confusion. "You are destroying yourself," he said, "for creatures that would eat you if they were larger." Yuna looked up at him. Her face was tired. Her hands were shaking slightly from the pain. But her voice was steady. "They are not creatures," she said. "They are babies. And babies do not need someone strong. They need someone who stays." Taewon opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He turned and left. The next morning, on the 11th day without food, Nari ate from Yuna's blistered hand. It was not much. A few small pieces of nutrient paste, taken slowly, with long pauses between each bite. But she ate. In the observation room, the monitoring system recorded the event with a simple notation. Subject 3, feeding resumed. In the palace above, Emperor Dohan watched the footage alone in his private chamber. He watched Yuna hold his smallest child, her hands burned and bandaged, humming a song from a world he had never visited. He watched Nari eat for the first time in 11 days. He watched the footage 3 times. Then he closed the screen and sat in silence for a very long while. The word spread faster than Dohan expected. Within 2 weeks of Yuna's arrival, every noble house in the Verath Dominion had heard the story. A human was raising the imperial hatchlings. Not a Verath warrior, not a stoneback guardian, not a Pelian biospecialist. A human. A small, soft, breakable human, with no armor and no fire, and hands covered in bandages. Some found it amusing. Most found it insulting. A few found it terrifying, though they would never admit why. Inside the nursery, Yuna did not know about any of this, and she probably would not have cared if she did. She was too busy. Bomi had started following her everywhere. When Yuna moved to the left side of the nursery, Bomi moved to the left side. When Yuna sat down, Bomi sat next to her, pressing her scaled body against Yuna's leg with enough force to leave bruises. When Yuna left the nursery for meals or sleep, Bomi would sit at the door and stare at it until she came back. "She has imprinted on you," Suji said one morning, watching from the observation room. There was something complicated in her voice. Not jealousy exactly. Something closer to wonder, mixed with an old, deep sadness. Suji had spent years with the hatchlings. She had the scars to prove it. But none of them had ever followed her like that. "Imprinted?" Yuna asked. "It is a bond, deep, permanent. In the old days, hatchlings would imprint on their mothers within the first week of life. It is how they learned who is family and who is enemy." Suji paused. "Bomi has decided you are her mother." Yuna looked down at Bomi, who was currently chewing on the fireproof ball while leaning against Yuna's hip. The hatchling was already the size of a large dog, and she was growing fast. Her scales had shifted from dull red to a rich, deep crimson, a sign of good health. "I can think of worse things," Yuna said. Hanild's progress was quieter, but just as real. The anxious hatchling had stopped producing uncontrolled firebursts almost entirely. He spent most of his time in the quiet corner Yuna had built, and he had developed a habit of resting his head in Yuna's lap when she sat with him. If she tapped the heartbeat rhythm on the floor, he would close his eyes and make a low humming sound that vibrated through his whole body. Suji said she had never heard a hatchling make that sound before. She did not know what it meant. "I think it means he is happy," Yuna said, and then there was Nari. Nari's recovery was the one that made the palace doctors stop talking and start staring. The tiny hatchling who had refused to eat, who had been gray and still and barely alive, was now eating 3 times a day. Her scales had gone from dull gray to a warm bronze. She was gaining weight. She was moving around the nursery, exploring corners, climbing on things, falling off things. And she was glowing. The glow started on the 3rd week, a soft golden light that came from beneath her scales, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. The palace doctors rushed to scan her, thinking it was a fever or a malfunction, but the scans came back clean. More than clean. Perfect. The glow was bioluminescence. It was a sign that appeared only in healthy, thriving imperial dragons. It meant that Nari's body had fully activated its growth cycle. It meant she was not just surviving, she was flourishing. No one had expected to see this glow at all. Not in a runt. Not in a hatchling that had nearly died. Yuna called the glow her little stars. She would hold Nari in the evenings, the golden light warm against her chest, and tell her she was the brightest thing in the whole palace. Emperor Dohan came to the nursery on the 22nd day. It was his first personal visit. He stood in the doorway, tall and armored, his presence filling the room like a storm filling the sky. Bomi saw him and immediately crouched low, a deep growl building in her throat. She placed herself between Dohan and Yuna. Her scales bristled, her claws dug into the floor. His own hatchling was protecting the human from him. Dohan did not move. Something passed across his face that might have been hurt, but he buried it quickly. Yuna stepped forward and placed her hand on Bomi's neck. She did not push or pull. She just rested her hand there and spoke softly. "It is okay. He is family. He is yours." Her scales smoothed. She looked at Yuna, then back at Dohan, and slowly she stepped aside. The Emperor walked forward, and for the first time since they were born, he stood close enough to his hatchlings to touch them. He did not touch them. He did not know how. After that, Dohan began visiting the nursery every evening. He never stayed long. He spoke to Yuna in short, careful sentences, asking questions about the hatchlings, about her methods, about why she did things the way she did. She answered plainly, without trying to impress him. He seemed to find this refreshing. But the palace was not the whole empire, and the nursery was not the whole world. Lord Kihan, head of House Sung, was one of the most powerful nobles in the Dominion. He was old, ambitious, and he had spent the last 200 years positioning his house to take power if the imperial bloodline ever failed. The birth of the hatchlings had been an obstacle. A human successfully raising them was an outrage. Kihan stood before the noble council and spoke with controlled fury. "This is a defilement," he said. "The imperial dragons are the sacred heart of the Verith people. To allow a lesser species, a species with no fire and no scales, to bond with them is an insult to every ancestor who built this empire. The hatchlings are being corrupted. Their instincts are being destroyed. If they cannot be raised properly by Verith hands, then they should be destroyed before they become something that is neither dragon nor pet." Several council members shifted uncomfortably. A few nodded. None spoke against him openly. Dohan heard the report and said nothing, but his claws left new marks on the arm of his throne. 2 nights later, the nursery's thermal system failed. It happened at 3 in the morning, when the palace was quiet and most of the staff were asleep. The heating units that kept the nursery at the correct temperature for growing hatchlings shut down without warning. The temperature dropped fast. Within 30 minutes, the room was colder than the surface of Kareth Prime's northern pole. Yuna woke to the sound of Nari crying. It was a thin, high sound, barely audible, and it cut through Yuna's sleep like a blade. She was on her feet in seconds, and what she saw made her blood go cold. Nari was convulsing, her tiny body shaking violently, her golden glow flickering like a candle in a storm. Hanel was pressed against the wall, shivering so hard his teeth were clicking. Even Bomi, the strongest of the three, was hunched low, her breathing shallow and labored. The emergency systems had not activated. The alarms had not triggered. This was not an accident. Yuna did not waste time trying to fix the machines. She did not call for help, because help was minutes away, and the hatchlings did not have minutes. She pulled every piece of fabric in the nursery into a pile in the center of the room. She gathered all 3 hatchlings, dragging Bomi by sheer stubbornness, carrying Hanul under one arm and Nari against her chest. She piled the fabric around them and over them, and then she lay down in the middle, wrapping her body around all 3. She was a human. Her body temperature was a joke compared to what they needed. She knew this. She did not care. She pressed Nari against her chest, pulled Hanul close to her stomach, and let Bomi press against her back. She held them as tightly as she could, and she gave them every degree of warmth her body could produce. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Suji found them 45 minutes later, when she arrived for her early shift. She saw the dead thermal systems, the freezing room, and Yuna curled around 3 hatchlings, shaking violently, her lips blue, her skin white. Suji activated the emergency heaters herself, manually overriding the sabotage systems. She called the medical team. She wrapped heating blankets around Yuna and the hatchlings, and she stood there, looking at the scene, her scarred face unreadable. And she said nothing for a very long time. Yuna spent 2 days recovering from mild hypothermia. She had new burns on her arms from where Hanul's stress fire had singed her during the night. Her hands, barely healed from Nari's chemical secretions, were raw and cracked again. Taewon came to see her in the medical ward. The thermal sabotage has been traced to Lord Kihan's agents. The Emperor knows. Yuna nodded. Are the hatchlings okay? They are fine, all 3. He paused. Why did you not leave the room? The emergency exit was 5 meters from you. And leave them alone in the cold? To save yourself. Yuna looked at him as if he had asked her why the sky was dark at night. The question did not make sense to her. That evening, Emperor Dohan stood before the full court. He was not shouting. He was not even raising his voice. But every person in the room felt the weight of his words like stones on their chests. "The human bled for my children," he said. "She burned for them. She froze for them. She gave them her own warmth when the machines failed and the systems were sabotaged by someone in this very court." He looked across the room, his eyes moving from face to face. "Which of you can say the same?" No one answered. The silence lasted a very long time. 6 weeks after Yuna arrived on Kareth Prime, Nari stopped eating again. It was not like the first time. The first time, Nari had been empty and gray and giving up on life. This was different. Nari was restless. She paced around the nursery in tight circles, her golden glow flickering unevenly, sometimes bright, sometimes almost gone. She would not hold still. She would not let Yuna pick her up. She snapped at Bomi when the larger hatchling came close, which she had never done before. Yuna watched her for 6 hours straight before she went to Suji. Something is wrong with Nari. Something new. Suji came to the nursery and observed through the window. After 10 minutes, the scarred dragon keeper's face changed. The color drained from her scales. She leaned against the wall as though her legs had suddenly become weak. "The first kindling," Suji whispered. Yuna had read about this in the protocols. The first kindling was the most critical moment in a young dragon's development. It was the phase when the hatchling's body generated its internal fire core for the first time, the burning center that would power the dragon for the rest of its life. Without a fire core, a dragon could not breathe flame, could not regulate its own temperature, could not survive. In the old days, the mother dragon would guide the kindling. She would breathe her own flame over the hatchling, gently, carefully, and the mother's fire would give the baby's fire something to reach toward, something to follow. It was like lighting one candle from another. Without a mother's flame, the fire core had no guide. It could spiral out of control, burning hotter and hotter until it consumed the hatchling from the inside. The historical records showed that even with proper guidance, the kindling was dangerous. Without it, the survival rate was barely half. Hours, maybe. A day, at most. Suji looked at Yuna, and for the first time, her expression was not hard or distant. It was afraid. "You cannot help her through this. You have no flame, no Vareth fire. You cannot guide the kindling." "Then who can?" "A Vareth flame-bearer, one of the senior dragon keepers. They are not mothers, but they can produce a controlled flame that might serve as a guide." Suji paused. "You must step aside for this." Within the hour, the news had reached the court. The noble council convened an emergency session. The palace doctors prepared the nursery for the kindling procedure. A senior flamebearer named Jung-woo was selected, a decorated dragon keeper with 40 years of experience. And everyone agreed on one thing: the human must leave the nursery. Taewon delivered the message himself. He found Yuna sitting beside Nari, who was now lying on her side, her breathing rapid and shallow, her golden glow pulsing faster and faster, like a heart beating too quickly. "The flame-bearer will take over from here," Taewon said. "You have done more than anyone expected, but this is beyond you." "No," Yuna said. Taewon blinked. "This is not a request. I understand that. The answer is still no. You cannot guide a kindling. You do not have fire. Nari has never been away from me for more than a few hours since I arrived. She has bonded with me. She trusts me. If you take me away from her now, during the most frightening and painful experience of her life, you will destroy that trust." Yuna's voice was calm, but there was iron underneath it. "I have seen this in human medicine. You do not separate a child from the person they are bonded to during a crisis. You do not take away the one thing that makes them feel safe. Not ever. And your alternative? You will hold her while she burns, because that is what the kindling is. She will produce temperatures that will melt the floor plating. You will die. I will not die, and I will not leave. Taewon went to the emperor. Do-han listened to the argument from both sides. The court urged removal. Suji, her voice cracking, said that she supported the flame-bearer taking over, not because she wanted to hurt Yuna, but because she could not bear to watch another death in that nursery. Jungwoo, the flame-bearer, was more direct. The human is brave. Bravery will not save the hatchling. Fire will. Do-han looked at the live feed from the nursery. On the screen, Yuna was sitting beside Nari, one hand resting on the hatchling's trembling back. Nari's head was pressed against Yuna's knee. Even in distress, even in the early stages of something that could kill her, the tiny dragon reached for the human. Let her try, Do-han said. The court erupted. Do-han raised one hand, and the room went silent. Jungwoo will stand by with emergency support. But the human stays with the hatchling. That is my decision. The kindling began at sunset. Nari's body temperature started climbing within the first hour. The monitors in the observation room tracked the numbers as they rose steadily past normal range, past elevated range, past the warning threshold. Inside the nursery, the air shimmered with heat. The floor plating under Nari began to glow a dull orange. Yuna did not move. She sat beside Nari, with both hands on the hatchling's body. Her palms were already red. She could feel the heat building beneath Nari's scales, a deep, living warmth that was nothing like the surface burns she had experienced before. This was the dragon's core trying to ignite, reaching for something to follow, something to match itself against, and finding nothing. It is okay, Yuna whispered. I am here. I am not going anywhere. By hour 4, Nari was making sounds that Yuna had never heard. Low, grinding moans that came from deep inside her chest. The golden glow beneath her scales was no longer gentle. It was fierce, almost blinding, flickering between gold and white. The chemical secretions from her skin had increased. Yuna's hands were covered in blisters. She wrapped them quickly in the bandages Suji had left for her, and put her hands right back. By hour 8, the burns started. Real burns. The kind that went past the skin and into the layers beneath. Yuna's forearms were red and swollen. Parts of her sleeves had melted away. In the observation room, the medical staff prepared to rush in. Taewon stood at the door, with his hand on the emergency release. Yuna looked up at the camera and shook her head once. Do not come in. Suji stood in the observation room, with tears running down her scarred face. She had her hands pressed flat against the glass. She is going to die in there, she said. She is going to burn to death holding that dragon. By hour 12, Nari's fire core entered the critical phase. The temperature inside the nursery exceeded anything the sensors were designed to measure. Alarms screamed. The emergency cooling systems activated automatically, flooding the room with cold air, but the heat coming from Nari evaporated it before it reached the floor. Yuna was shaking. Not from cold this time, from pain. Her hands were wrapped in soaked bandages that were already drying and stiffening from the heat. The skin on her chest, where Nari was pressed against her, was raw. But she held on. By hour 16, Nari's fire core destabilized. The monitors showed it clearly. The internal temperature spiked wildly, up and down, like a flame caught in a storm. Nari's body went rigid. Her moans turned into a high, thin scream that made everyone in the observation room cover their ears. Jungwoo stepped forward, flame ready, prepared to intervene. And then, Yuna began to sing. It was the same lullaby she had hummed on her first night. A simple melody from Earth, the kind of song that mothers sang to babies who could not sleep. Nothing magical about it. Nothing special. Just a human voice, rough with pain and exhaustion, singing softly to a burning dragon. But underneath the melody was something else. A rhythm, a pattern. Yuna's heartbeat, steady and constant, transmitted through her hands and her chest into Nari's body. A rhythm that said, "Follow me, match me, slow down, breathe with me. You are not alone. Follow me, follow me, follow me." Nari's fire core flickered, spiked, flickered again, and then, like a wild flame finding the shape of a lantern, it steadied. It synchronized with Yuna's heartbeat. It found the rhythm and followed it, and slowly, degree by degree, it stabilized. At hour 19, Nari's scales flushed pure gold, not the flickering, uneven glow of a sick hatchling, a deep, rich, permanent gold that lit up the entire nursery like sunrise. Nari's fire core locked into place, her body relaxed, her breathing slowed. She opened her eyes, looked up at Yuna, and made a sound that was soft and low and full of something that needed no translation. Nari had completed her first kindling. The palace medical records would later show that it was the healthiest kindling documented in 3 generations. Yuna collapsed 7 seconds after Nari's core stabilized. She fell sideways onto the nursery floor, unconscious before she hit the ground. The medical team rushed in and carried her out. Her hands, her forearms, and parts of her chest were badly burned. She had mild smoke damage in her lungs. She was dehydrated, exhausted, and running a fever from the chemical exposure. She spent 4 days in the palace medical ward, drifting in and out of consciousness. The doctors healed the worst of the burns, but said the scars on her hands would likely be permanent. The tissue was too damaged in some places for full regeneration. During those 4 days, all 3 hatchlings refused to eat. Bomi sat at the nursery door and did not move. Hanel retreated to his quiet corner and would not come out. Nari, glowing bright gold, curled into the exact spot on the floor where Yuna had been sitting, and stayed there, waiting. On the 4th evening, Emperor Dohan came to the medical ward. He did not bring guards. He pulled a chair beside Yuna's bed and sat down. She was awake, barely, her bandaged hands resting on the blanket. She looked very small in the medical bed, very human. "My people breathe fire," Dohan said quietly. "We were born from volcanoes. We conquered star systems with flame and scale and strength." He paused, looking at her ruined hands. "And yet a human with no fire held my daughter through the kindling and guided her core with a heartbeat and a song." Yuna said nothing. She was too tired to speak. "Your species endures," Dohan said. "I am beginning to think that is more powerful than anything we have." Yuna closed her eyes. She might have smiled, or it might have been the pain medication. Dohan stayed by her bed until she fell asleep, and then he stayed a little longer. Yuna came back to the nursery on the 5th day. The palace doctors had told her to rest for at least 2 more weeks. She thanked them politely, got out of bed, rewrapped her bandages, and walked barefoot through the lower corridors because no one had thought to bring her shoes. Suji found her halfway there and fell into step beside her without a word. She was carrying a pair of boots she had taken from the staff quarters. They were too big for Yuna, but they were warm. Yuna put them on and kept walking. When the nursery door opened, Bomi was the first to react. The large hatchling, who had not moved from her position by the door in 4 days, launched herself at Yuna with a force that knocked the human back 3 steps. Yuna caught herself against the doorframe and wrapped her bandaged arms around Bomi's neck. The hatchling was making sounds, short, broken, desperate sounds that were not growls and not roars. Something that Vareth scientists would later spend months trying to classify before Suji finally told them to stop being foolish, because the word was obvious. Bomi was crying. Hanel came next, emerging from his quiet corner and pressing himself against Yuna's side, so hard that she'd had to brace her feet to stay standing. He pushed his head under her arm and stayed there, trembling slightly, his breath warm and steady against her ribs. And Nari, glowing bright and gold, climbed up Yuna's legs and into her arms, and pressed her face into the curve of Yuna's neck, and did not let go for the rest of the day. Yuna sat down on the nursery floor, with 3 dragons piled around her and against her and on top of her. Her burns ached. Her hands throbbed beneath the bandages. She was exhausted and sore, and still running a low fever. She was home. The weeks that followed were the quietest and most important of Yuna's time on Kareth Prime. The hatchlings were growing fast now. Bomi had reached the size of a small horse, her crimson scales deepening to a dark burgundy that the palace scholars said was the mark of a guardian-class dragon. She had become calm and confident, no longer driven by fear or frustration. When she walked beside Yuna through the palace corridors during their daily exercise walks, the guards would stop and stare. Bomi moved like a creature who knew exactly who she was and what she was for. Hanhel had grown into something unexpected. The anxious, spark-spitting hatchling had become gentle and endlessly curious. He spent hours exploring the palace gardens, examining plants and insects and water features with a careful, focused attention that reminded the scholars of their own researchers. His fire bursts were fully under control now, and when he did produce flame, it was precise and beautiful. Thin streams of blue-white fire that he used to warm stones for the garden insects to rest on. The gardeners adored him, and Nari was the wonder. The runt who should have died was now the first of the 3 to achieve full bioluminescent display. It happened one evening during a formal court gathering. Dohan had invited Yuna and the hatchlings to attend, a decision that had caused considerable argument among the nobles, some of whom still refused to accept a human in the imperial court. The throne room was enormous, built from black stone with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. Hundreds of Verith nobles filled the hall, their scales gleaming in the torchlight, their voices a low, rumbling hum. Yuna stood to the side with the 3 hatchlings, feeling very small and very out of place. Then Nari stepped forward. It started slowly, a warm glow from beneath her golden scales, brighter than usual, then brighter still. The glow spread across her entire body, and then it did something no one in the room had ever seen from a dragon so young. The light separated from her scales and floated upward, like sparks from a fire, except they did not fade. They hung in the air, hundreds of tiny golden lights that drifted toward the ceiling and filled the throne room with a soft, living radiance. Full bioluminescent display, an ability that usually did not develop until a dragon was decades old. Nari was 8 weeks. The court went silent. Every noble, every guard, every servant stopped moving and looked up at the golden lights floating above them. Some of them had tears on their scaled faces. Some had their mouths open. One elderly scholar dropped to her knees. Nari walked back to Yuna and sat beside her feet, looking very pleased with herself. Her little stars filled the room like a second sky. Lord Kihan made his final move 3 days later. He had been quiet since the thermal sabotage incident, but he had not given up. He called for a purity tribunal, an ancient legal challenge that demanded the severing of any bond between an imperial dragon and a non-Varath being. The law was old and rarely used, but it had never been formally removed from the books. The tribunal was held in the Great Hall. The nobles assembled. The legal scholars presented the ancient texts. Kihan stood before the court and argued that the bond between the hatchlings and the human was unnatural, corrupting, and a threat to the purity of the imperial bloodline. He spoke well. He cited history. He appealed to tradition and pride and fear. When he finished, he turned toward Yuna with barely concealed contempt. The human should be removed from the palace immediately, and the hatchlings should be rebonded to proper Varath handlers before the corruption becomes irreversible. The room was quiet. All eyes turned to the Emperor. Dohan began to rise from his throne. But before he could speak, Bomi moved. The great hatchling stepped forward from Yuna's side and placed herself between Kihan and the human. She drew herself up to her full height, which was already considerable for her age, and she unfurled her wings. The room gasped. In Varath culture, the unfurling of wings in the presence of others was one of the most significant gestures a dragon could make. It had different meanings depending on the context. In battle, it meant challenge. Between mates, it meant devotion. And between a dragon and another being in the presence of a threat, it meant one thing and one thing only: chosen family. Bomi was declaring, in the oldest and most unbreakable language of the Varath people, that Yuna was hers. Not a servant, not a caretaker, not a tool. Family. Hanuel stepped up beside his sister and unfurled his wings as well. His were smaller, more delicate, edged with the soft blue of his controlled flame. He stood steady and quiet, his eyes fixed on Kihan, without a trace of the anxiety that had once defined him. And Nari, tiny Nari, climbed onto Yuna's shoulder, wrapped her tail around the human's arm, and began to glow. The golden lights rose from her scales and filled the great hall once again. And in their light, every face in the room was visible, every expression, every choice. Kihan looked at the three dragons, at their wings spread wide, at the golden light falling around him like judgment, and he could not speak. His legal challenge required the tribunal to find that the bond was harmful. But the evidence standing in front of him said something else entirely. The tribunal was dismissed. Kihan's challenge collapsed under its own weight. Within the week, he was quietly stripped of his rank and his seat on the noble council. No one objected. That evening, Emperor Dohan summoned Yuna to the throne room. She came with bandaged hands and borrowed boots and dragons at her side. Dohan stood before her and the assembled court and spoke. In the history of the Varath Dominion, no non-Varath has ever held an imperial title. This has been our tradition for 10,000 years. He paused. Traditions are supposed to serve us. When they stop serving us, we are fools to serve them. He extended his hand. In his palm was a small pin made of black volcanic glass and gold, the symbol of the keeper of the imperial flame. Yuna of Earth, I name you keeper of the imperial flame, guardian of the imperial hatchlings, member of the advisory council, citizen of the Dominion, and family of my house. Yuna took the pin. Her bandaged fingers shook slightly, but her eyes were steady. Thank you. She had never been good at speeches. The news traveled across the galaxy like light from a new star. A human had been given an imperial title in the most powerful dragon empire in known space. Not for strength, not for conquest, not for technology or wealth or political maneuvering, for holding on. Other empires and species began sending requests. They wanted human nurses, human caregivers, human counselors. They wanted the species that had no claws, and no fire, and no armor, because it turned out that what they needed was not someone who could fight for them, but someone who would stay with them. Taiwan stood with Yuna on the palace balcony one evening, watching the ships move across the sky. He had become something close to a friend, though neither of them would have used that word out loud. Your species, he said, shaking his head. No claws, no venom, no armor, no fire. How did you survive your own world? Yuna leaned against the balcony railing. Below them, the lava rivers of Kareth Prime glowed orange in the darkness. Somewhere inside the palace, She could hear Bomi rumbling contentedly, and Hanuel humming his quiet hum, and Nari making the soft clicking sound she made when she was about to fall asleep. "We held on to each other," Yuna said. Taewon considered this for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, as though something he had never understood had finally become clear. Far below in the nursery, which was no longer a bunker, but a wide, warm garden room, with soft light and open air, and plants growing between the stones, Nari lay curled on a cushion, glowing gently gold. Hanuel was stretched out beside her, his head resting on his paws, his breathing slow and peaceful. Bomi was the last awake, as always, her great crimson body curled in a protective circle around the other two, one eye open, watching the door. When Yuna came in, Bomi's eye closed. The last guardian was home. She could rest now. Yuna sat down in the middle of her dragons. Bomi pressed against her back. Hanuel shifted to rest his head in her lap. Nari, half asleep, climbed into her arms and nestled against her chest, glowing softly like a small sun. Yuna hummed the lullaby, the same one as always, the same one from the first night, when she had sat alone on a scorched floor in a bunker deep underground, surrounded by 3 frightened babies that everyone else had given up on. It was not a magic song. It had no power. It was just a melody that a tired woman hummed to the children she loved. Above them, through the open ceiling of the garden nursery, the stars of Kareth Prime turned slowly in the dark sky. Emperor Dohan stood in the doorway and watched them for a long time. The most powerful ruler in the Dominion, commander of fleets and master of worlds, standing in a doorway watching a human woman sing to his dragons. For the first time in a very long time, he smiled. And in the warm silence of the nursery, with the sound of breathing and the soft golden glow of a dragon who had once been too small to survive, the story settled into its final shape. Not a story about fire or empires or the vastness of space. A story about the simplest and most stubborn thing in the universe.